Good evening. I'm Tom Perry, Deputy Publisher of Random House. Welcome to our Random House Big Ideas Night on the subject of gun violence and reform in America. Polling shows that a strong majority of Americans continue to support gun reform, and yet a hectic national election and unwieldy news cycles have stifled the important conversations we need to have and the action we must need to take. Nevertheless, our panelists tonight are all resolved to do the work that so desperately needs to be done, and I'm pleased to introduce them. Toni Jensen teaches in the MFA programs at the University of Arkansas and the Institute of American Indian Arts. She is a 2020 recipient of a Creative Writing Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, and her work has been published in Orion, Catapult, and Ecotone. She is Métis. Her book is Carrie, a memoir of survival on stolen land, just published in September. Elected in 2012 as the youngest member of the US Senate, Chris Murphy has earned a reputation as a serious legislator who is willing to stand up for his principles and reach across the aisle. Since the Newtown school shooting in December 2012, he has also become the best known leader in Congress on confronting the plague of gun violence in America. Now in his second term representing Connecticut, he and his wife, Kathy, an attorney, have two young sons, Owen and Ryder. His book is The Violence Inside Us, a brief history of an ongoing American tragedy, also published in September. Thrust into the world of activism by the largest school shooting in American history, Parkland survivor David Hogg has become one of the most compelling voices of his generation. With his friends from high school, he co-founded March for Our Lives, now one of the world's largest youth-led movements. David is the co-author with his younger sister Lauren of #NeverAgain, a New York Times bestseller. Committed to becoming an agent for change, David has made it his mission to increase voter participation and civic engagement, resolved that no other young person should have to experience the tragic impact of gun violence. Lauren Hogg is a co-founder of March for Our Lives and the founder of March for Our Lives Parkland City chapter. Today, Lauren is a senior in high school and is a leading gun violence prevention organizer. She is the co-author with her older brother David of the book #NeverAgain. Never pass up the opportunity to plug a book twice. Erica Ford has dedicated her life to the liberation of her people from oppression and racism. Her journey began on December 12, 1987, with the December 12th movement, and she hasn't looked back. As CEO and co-founder of LifeCamp, she has played a major role in transforming New York City as an architect for the city's crisis management system, the New York City Mobile Trauma Units, and New York City Peace Week. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd like to ask each of you, just to start, to tell us a little bit about your book or your organization. And I'd like to start with Erica Ford. LifeCamp appears to take a holistic approach to problem solving. Can you explain that in the context of gun reform?
I think that when we're dealing with it, thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you for speaking my book into existence. I know I'm here because Random House, we're getting ready to do some great things. Now, I'm only kidding, but I'm not kidding. When you're looking at the question of gun violence, you have to look at it from its holistic space. The person that's picking up the gun, the people that are impacted by the gun. Why do you look at the gun as something that is a means to resolving your inner pain or your problem or your interpersonal problem or the impact of trauma in society? Whatever the thing is, you have to deal with it holistically to cut it at its root. And so we deal with violence as a disease and help people cure from that disease, from the space of giving folks unconventional and conventional therapeutic services to help them heal and deal with their real issue, as well as like what we're in the middle of right this second, just going out and interrupting and mediating the incidents and taking guns out of people's hands so that they won't cause harm to somebody else. And I think that, you know, we have to deal with both sides of the gun. We have to deal with the mindset that picks up the gun, and also the infiltration of guns in community all at the same time. And so that's why it's important for all of us to be here having the conversation, because we all have a lane down that road.
Toni Jensen, it seems you grew up in a culture of guns. And what was the impetus for you to sit down and write a memoir that deals with the subject? And what do you hope readers will take away?
In 2016, I experienced an incident of gun violence, and my nephew the same summer, just a few months apart, also experienced an incident of gun violence. So yes, I grew up in gun culture. My father and his 5 brothers all were card-carrying NRA members. I grew up situated in hunting culture, in particular in small town in rural Iowa. So I was no stranger to guns, and certainly no stranger to gun violence either. But something about those two events or incidences in such close proximity really got me to thinking more about the structures that support gun violence in our culture, and how my stories that were personal, domestic violence, gun violence, those sorts of stories are interlinked with policy and structures in our country, and lack of support or support for resources to help people who have been victims of domestic and gun violence. So I felt like it was very timely, those two things happening all at once. And very shortly after that, where I teach at University of Arkansas, that our campus carry law was enacted. And now people can get a permit and carry on my campus. So all those things at once, it seemed like that was all I could think about. That was all I could write about. And so carry grew out of that time period, those experiences.
So Lauren or David, whoever wants to field this one, March for Our Lives is just a little over 2.5 years old, right? And yet it has huge reach. Can you tell us how your organization has grown, and what's its focus today? Has it changed in the short time it's been alive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure David will want to add more to the logistical side of this. But I think holistically, our organization has changed and evolved in many ways, much like the young people that the organization consists of. While we have grown and learned from our mistakes mostly, our organization has as well. More importantly than that, I think what's attributed to the growth of our organization and the success of our organization is the individuals who already had pre-existing organizations that have been working for many, many years, like Erica, like so many other individuals that we have been able to learn from and absorb that information and regenerate it to the public. Yeah, David, you want to add more to the logistics of that?
Yeah, I think the main way that our chapters have continued to grow, which has been amazing to see. In the beginning of March, understandably, I think it can't be understated the amount of the role that privilege played in us getting any attention whatsoever as people that survived gun violence, whatsoever, happening at a predominantly white high school in the suburb. And I think with that, a big thing that we've been working on, and that we continue to learn from, it's difficult as a youth-led organization, because as we are young people, I think even though in the beginning we didn't necessarily feel that way, it's humbling for sure to be in this role and recognize that, I make mistakes. The organization has certainly made mistakes in the past, and how we are trying to continue to evolve from that continuously and do better, and especially talk to the people that reach out to us, or overtly say to us, we need to do better in X, Y, and Z ways. And I fully welcome that, and would encourage that even to step in, and just reaching out to those people too, to work on expanding. I don't know if expanding the mission is the right word, but making sure that that our part in the gun violence prevention movement, the small part that we play in comparison to someone like Erica. Okay, sorry, my friend has a dog, and it almost just, it's like 7. Sorry, it's giant. But what I was going to say is, like, basically reaching out to the people and building coalitions in the movement in an authentic way, in a way that recognizes the privileges that we've had and the privilege that we have, while recognizing the veterans of the movement like Erica and many others, like Community Justice Action Fund, Pastor Mike in Oakland, California, and so many others that I, don't even know of, who've come before us that are predominantly, Black and Brown and Indigenous women that have been on the forefront of gun violence prevention. So that's been a really big focus, along with also, as Erica talked about, addressing the systemic role that Indigenous genocide and white supremacy has played in the creation and enabling of gun violence in the United States, and addressing the fact that the reason why places like Parkland, Florida don't have shootings on a daily basis isn't because we have the most police officers, it's because we have the most resources. And recognizing the inherent structural problems and the roots of white supremacy that gun violence comes from as a big part of that. And, it's difficult to do as a young person. I'm learning on a scale that I don't think most people would. And so is the organization and people in the organization. And when we make mistakes, it's in front of, not just our friends, but thousands or millions of people. And it's tough when those things happen. But we just try to prove, that we learn and get better through our actions.
It's interesting that you bring up history, because that is a great segue to Senator Murphy's book, which you would think from a senator might be a dry position paper on gun policy. But Senator Murphy, you step back and you take the long view of violence in this country. So what is the story that you're telling about where we are now?
Well, listen, thanks for including me this evening. All the folks on this call are just tremendous advocates and thinkers. Really excited to be with them this evening, and just really impressive to see how this movement has expanded and grown legs. And I, in the book that I wrote, really tried to track the education that I've undergone since my life was changed. I'm deeply embarrassed that I was in public service for as long as I was and didn't work on the issue of gun violence, didn't take the time to study its roots. It wasn't until the shooting in Sandy Hook that I became an advocate, and I hope a leader. And this book called The Violence Inside Us is really an effort to sort of track how America became this exceptionally violent place, right? Why is it that you are 20 times more likely in this country to be felled by gun violence than any other high-income nation? And the book tells the story of the biology of violence, right? How humans are sort of more prone to violence than other species. It talks about the unique nature of American violence, and there's no way to tell the story of American violence than without telling a story about race. Violence has been used by whites to suppress blacks for centuries. The mechanism of that violence has just changed. And there's no way to tell the story of American violence without the story of access to guns. Just no other country decided to create a proliferation of these high impact deadly weapons like the United States did. And so, I think there are a lot of people who have launched themselves into this fight, who have become part of the movement, who maybe haven't had the opportunity or the time to step back and understand how we got there. And that's what this book tries to do. And by understanding how we got here, understanding how American racism, American poverty, and America's unique relationship with guns has put us here, then that charts the path forward. It tells you that you can change all the gun laws that you want, but we will still be an exceptionally violent place, because if you don't do something about the connection between poverty and violence, and you don't do something about the connection between systemic racism and violence, then you ultimately aren't going to bring down that trajectory. And this book is an attempt to sort of tell that story. So a lot of it is a history. And then at the end, it takes those lessons to paint a picture as to where we go moving forward.
So you each came to this subject in very personal ways, it seems to me. And does it concern you that it takes some type of involvement with gun violence to become motivated and to fight the fight that needs to be fought. Any thoughts? That's for anyone in the group.
I think that anything that we do in our life, most of us don't get involved in it until it's a personal impact on us, whether it's going to buy the latest pair of Nikes or going to a movie or unfortunately getting involved in social justice acts or just regular environmental acts like anything, saving animals, any kind of issue. Most people don't get involved until either someone brings it to their attention or it personally impacts their life, and then they have empathy and compassion for that issue and then want to do more. It is up to us who are involved in the issue to create the environment where it brings people in and people want to find out more. Similar to, building a campaign when you're running for office. People didn't know about Chris Murphy until he put out that first literature or talked about himself, and then people learned about him and they wanted to do more and work with him and help him get to the next step and the next step and the next step. But if he didn't open a door, and if, Sandy Hook or what's my school here?
Parkland.
I want to say March for Our Lives, but that's not the school. And your phone is mute, so you can't hear what you're saying.
Douglas.
Douglas, right. So, and until those happened, those young people didn't even really know, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And a lot of times we get into bashing people because they don't know what they don't know. And we don't realize that we didn't know what we didn't know until we knew, But so I think that we should be patient with the people's process, but also as a leader and an organizer, it's up to us to educate the masses of people to know more, right? And to continue to paint the picture and win people over to what we're doing.
Erica frames it perfectly, which is, there are populations that have been living with the epidemic of gun violence for their entire life. But, maybe there wasn't a mature enough, advanced enough political movement to plug into. And I think we have been able to build that over the course of the last 7 years, at least on the issue of changing gun laws. And so for people that have been living it, there now is, I think, a clearer pathway to get involved. But then there's also this new phenomenon in which no one can escape it, right? Every single parent has to think about what they're going to say to their child when they come home and ask them why they got shoved into the bathroom on Tuesday morning with 22 other kids and told to remain silent as long as they could to practice for what happens if a bad man comes into the building. And so all of a sudden, everyone has to confront this issue and the prospect of violence, even if it's not, a regular occurrence in your life or your neighborhood as it is in some places. And I think those two things coming together, the maturation of our movement, accessible to people who were looking for an outlet, and then also the fact that it's inescapable for most Americans today in a way that it wasn't a decade ago, has changed the nature of this conversation.
I also think it's important to note that gun violence in a way is similar to climate change, COVID. It doesn't care if you believe in its truth or not. It doesn't care if you believe in it because it will be there. It's truth. It's our uniquely American reality. It's just so much, but it's crazy how people can be surrounded by gun violence, can be surrounded by climate change, and have its effects be on their front door, and they still don't believe it. But on the adverse side of that, there are people who will never have to be affected by gun violence that will care. Just like COVID, just like climate change, it's about empathy. It's about creating a nation full of empathy, especially amongst young people. Organizing empathy in a sense, and luckily we have social media, so even in times like this of COVID, we are able to organize around this empathy to change the country that we live in now.
So Toni, you chose to put this in a book, to write this. What that suggests to me that you think that the culturally a book has some value for telling, for the empathy that Lauren just spoke about. How far do you think that can go? Do you have a sense?
I think it can go a long way. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily my book can make it go a long way, but it does trace the history of gun violence in our country all the way back to the founding of the country. I talk about removal. Where I'm sitting right now in my house is just, about a mile, maybe not even that, off the Trail of Tears, which we call MLK Junior Boulevard here in town. But we talk about removal of the Cherokee and other tribes, and we don't talk about that they were removed at the point of a bayonet or the first long guns, right? They were removed at gunpoint. And so trying to draw, and that's true where everyone in the audience lives. Native people were removed from the land, or the land was stolen. So tracing the history back, I think, can be educational and persuasive. I think can help create empathy in the sense like Lauren and Erica and Chris are talking about, that it's everywhere, literally everywhere. All the land we sit on is stolen land for the most part, and stolen at gunpoint for the most part. So once you know that and learn that, you can't unknow it. Also, the statistic that startled me the most that I discovered when writing the book, that wasn't a personal statistic, the majority of gun owners in this country right now are white and upper middle class to affluent. That's the statistic. And I don't think people like to think about that, people who live in certain sorts of affluent neighborhoods, right? That if there's such a high volume of gun ownership in your neighborhood, probably also then there's the possibility of gun violence, or at least if there's gunners in your neighborhood, do you ask the people next door before your child goes over to play where they keep their guns? So knowing and starting the dialogue, I think, can be very helpful to broadening the scope of empathy. If guns and gun violence literally are everywhere all around the country, then it's everyone's problem, it's everyone's issue, it's everyone's concern, and everyone should be welcome at the table.
But that also gets into the subject of sort of what the government can do, and then what the people can do. What the people can do through activism or through journalism. And Toni, earlier you mentioned the NRA. So since the Reagan era, the NRA's influence spiked remarkably. I think maybe it's teetering a little bit, but I'm curious, can you say more, Toni, about the sort of the impact of the NRA in the culture you were living in?
Sure. I mean, everyone in my family is or was an NRA member. Everyone I knew, their family pretty much belonged to the NRA, and they joined because they were hunters, they were sportsmen. It started more that way as a gun safety and sporting organization. It made a major shift. Pre-1970s, the NRA did not have a lobbying wing. They were not a political organization. And so that shift happened right before the Reagan era. And Reagan was the first president who they endorsed, and the only president they'd ever endorsed up until that point. And while that was happening, you have to consider too that time in America, there was a recession all across the middle of the country. And so people had lost their farms, they'd lost their livelihoods. There was this sense of fear of things being taken, and the NRA really capitalized on that. So how I see that is hopeful. It doesn't sound very hopeful, but if there was that seismic shift within the NRA within my lifetime, it can undergo another seismic shift. Culture changes all the time. There are so many things culturally that are different right now than I think any of us would have thought were possible. COVID, for example, changing people's behaviors or not in some cases, but in many cases, we've undergone a major cultural shift. So there isn't any reason that we can't continue to push for the NRA to make a cultural shift as well. There's been some success. Some of the people who are in the little Zoom squares next to me are responsible for some of that success. So the NRA was down membership revenue about 34% last year. And that's in large part to public pressure. So we can keep that public pressure on. It can change again as an organization. I'm not suggesting that it necessarily needs to go away, but it can shift back. to what it once was, or something closer.
Erica, your organization is, based on your bio, you are working with government, but you're also working, I assume, at a grassroots level. So how much faith do you have in the government part of a solution?
I think the government has to provide the resources to people to help build and fund the solution. The solution comes from the people who are closest to the problem. The government has to have faith. It has to give the resources to the individuals on the ground so that they could do the work, which is in my organization, like to my staff, I'm the government, right? And so right now, like while I'm on this Zoom, we're dealing with a situation. And so they're telling me, give me the resources, let me deal with this situation, right? And I'm like, well, we all gotta work together. Like we gotta do it, like I gotta roll, this one gotta roll. They're like, let me do this, I'll get back to you and let you know what resources I need. And so the same way is the same way to the government, whether it's, any entity has to, be able to work in conjunction to co-produce safety in our community. And it is going to take unconventional ways because what we are seeing right now is not normal. It's not normal. It's not normal for individuals to go and shoot up schools. And it's not normal for people to live in these conditions every single day of their life, and never find a space to heal and never find a space to just escape and breathe and just be able to sleep a comfortable night, And so the two ends are not normal. And so how do we help people heal? Because trauma is inside of both of them, right? And we can fight about whose trauma is worse and whose trauma looks worse or whose trauma it is, but we all need to heal so that we can coexist in this world, because the more we fight, and the more people get hurt, the more people get hurt. And so I think that there's a lot of people in government that's in there for their egotistical reasons. And then there's some people who want to help, but are in a web of a system that is not set up to allow people to get the help that they need in the time in which they need it. And so we have to, work strongly together to shift the narrative of how government exists in our neighborhoods.
So, Senator Murphy.
No, listen, I mean, these systems that incentivize this repeating trauma are systems either created by government or sanctioned by government. And so, to the extent that we find this link between poverty and violence, we made a decision in this country to subject millions of Americans to poverty despite the fact that they're employed and playing by the rules. Systemic racism is informal, but it is also formal through law. And one of the most interesting things, that I sort of discovered in the process of writing my book was, in the last 100 years, there are these two moments where American violence rates start to decline rapidly, right? These two descents of American violence rates. And it is not coincidental that they occur after the two most significant anti-gun violence laws passed by Congress in the last 100 years. Literally within a couple of years of the 1930s Firearms Control Acts, violence starts to decline. And within years of the Brady background check bill and the assault weapons ban, violence rates start to come down. And there's probably complicated reasons for that, but government reflects norms, but they also set norms. And so when people see their government stepping in and taking bold action to confront violence, people take cues. And we have to understand that virtuous cycle that can occur between, as Erica was saying, the private actions of individuals that ultimately end up in government making changes, but also when government makes changes, that also sends moral signals to the country and to the community that often result in change.
So it must be enormously frustrating for you, I would think, in the current Congress, the current Senate. Do you have any sense that there might be motion? Can there be compromise? Should there be compromise?
Well, I do have hope, but I only have hope because of the people that are surrounding me on this screen, right? I mean, I was in a conversation with the president and Republicans last summer over a background checks bill, and we didn't end up getting there. But I was getting these calls, out of the blue from Republican senators who historically have voted against any anti-gun violence measures, who all of a sudden, were calling me to tell me that if a background checks bill got to the floor, this time around they might be willing to vote for it. And the reason is because it's not because they had a moral epiphany. It's because they just are tired of having to go up against David and Lauren and Erica and Moms Demand Action and Gabby Giffords. They just sort of are beaten down at this point because we are more powerful as a movement now than the gun lobby is. And so as we continue to grow our power, compared to what the status quo has, compared to what the gun lobby has, then there will be continued movement on the other side of the aisle. Listen, compromise has ultimately got to be on the table, but I'd rather just beat them and pass the laws that we know work.
So, David, I wonder, since you and Lauren are in the trenches, do you feel this? I mean, the senator sounded a little optimistic about the power of your movements to force change. Do you sort of feel that in the day-to-day, or do you have trouble being motivated? Because
I think I'm curious to hear what Lauren thinks about this too. I think for me, it's never really been about feeling hopeful, because I never really have. I kind of accepted from the beginning that we were never going to defeat the NRA, but I like, not in that way, but like, I mean, in the beginning, we were just a bunch of pissed off teenagers with literally $0 in a living room floor. So, why not just try? I mean, if anything, not that we have time on our side, because, we don't want people to continue dying every year from gun violence, but frankly, the NRA tends to be significantly less diverse than the country and a lot older. So ultimately, we're going to outlive them. But I think what it just comes down to for me is just self-care, and remembering that, when I need a break, it requires me to set times, to take care of myself every day, to stop doing the work, even though it feels selfish. It took me realizing that it's actually selfish to continue working 18 hours a day for months on end and then burn out for months at a time, because it drains the resources of those around you, and it becomes a kind of threat and drain on the movement, because I'm part of the movement. And if I'm not taking care of myself, then I'm not doing my part to take care of the movement, right? So really what it's come down to for me is just sustainability, and hopefully leading the small part of the movement that Lauren and I lead, in my own way, by showing people what self-care looks like and taking a step back. Because I know when I take a step back that Erica's, always out there fighting. And if she's not out there fighting, there are other people from Life Camp. Or if she's not out there, then I'm able to step in and I'm there. And I'm able to rest in those times. And really, that's what scares me the most. I think the second biggest enemy to the movement, only to the NRA, is frankly our trauma and ourselves, and burning ourselves out. And the comparison of trauma and the trauma Olympics, I think youth activists and just people in general can find themselves in, where we get so caught up in comparing who suffered more, when in reality we lose sight of the fact that we just want to end suffering in the first place for everyone, even if we don't necessarily understand everything. But yeah, just that's been my main thing, is just taking care of myself and surrounding myself with really good friends that care about me, and watching shows like The Office and turning off the news, or watching like Schitt's Creek and stuff is really good.
Yeah,
did you want to?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with David more on that. One way that I've really learned about this is I've actually read and done research and written papers on passion fatigue that so many of us experience who are involved in this fight. And that's one of my main ways that I've tackled it, is by actually learning about it, by reading it, by producing papers at school that I distribute to friends, whoever needs it. But I think beyond that, I can't emphasize enough what David said about if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not taking care of your movement, of your organization. And just looking at studies that show, it's more efficient, it's more effective for you to take a short break than for you to completely burn yourself out. And the amount of trauma that's involved in this work is really just incomprehensible. And especially for the young people that are involved in this, our brains are still developing, and the psychological impact that this has on us, I'm sure, is completely detrimental. But I think overall, it's definitely hard in times of, social isolation, because what used to get me up and out of the house and feeling better and more hopeful was talking with other young people, was talking with people who are involved with this fight every day. But definitely taking time, watching movies, reading books that are just kind of escapism. I think that's the best thing you can do for yourself in the movement.
We have some questions coming through on the chat function. This is one. How do you suggest we talk to family members who don't see eye to eye with us on the necessity for gun reform? Anyone want to jump on that one?
I probably could address that. Yeah, I've had many interesting 4th of July barbecues and picnics with my dad and my uncles on this very subject. When writing the book, someone asked my husband my position on guns, and he said she's anti-gun violence. And so I've taken that and just rolled with it pretty hard with family as well. And I think you can start there. I've yet to have anyone argue back against being against gun violence. And so if you position yourself in that sort of a space, conversation can begin. Really, also, I mean, my uncles have been in the military, as is true for most Native people. Mostly they're gun owners because they're hunters, right? And I respect their positions there, the cultural ties to hunting and trapping, and I respect their service. Also, though, we have a gun problem in America. And so if you start from a place of respect and everyone has to be at the table, I found you can make small inroads. We have conversation, we don't shout about it. And so it really is a matter of, I think, showing respect for the people, and then opening the dialogue with the common ground that no one wants gun violence.
Why are so few mainstream conservatives speaking about gun reform today? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, for a long time, the NRA was the NRA endorsement was the most important imprimatur that any Republican or conservative candidate could have on their candidacy. And, maybe I'm being a little overly political, but my sort of analysis of it is pretty simple. I think the Republican Party sort of ran out of ideas after a while, and they became only an anti-government party. And so in order to win a nomination to run for office, you had to anti-government the next candidate. And the best endorsement to have to show how much you hated the government was the organization that supported the armed insurrection of the American populace against the government. I think that, a lot of, conservatives, even though they probably knew that, 80–90% of their constituents supported things like universal background checks, just, had come to accept this proposition that you kind of had to just be silent on the issue of guns and make the NRA happy if you ultimately wanted to win an election. And that's, it's a testament to, how nimble and how powerful the gun lobby became. And, the gun lobby was always this house of cards, though. They didn't actually advocate for the positions of their members, but nobody contested them because, conservatives didn't talk about this issue, and Democrats were taught for generations, or at least for one generation, the one that I came up in, to just shut up about guns. Just don't talk about it. Just don't pick a fight with anybody on this subject. And it wasn't until, people like David and Lauren and others came up and started asking questions of the gun lobby, like, wait a second, are the things you stand for actually in line with your own members, that the NRA and other groups like it started to fall apart a little bit. It's not coincidental. So I think that's the reason that a lot of mainstream conservatives have remained quiet on this issue. But I think that that's in the process of changing.
another viewer makes the comment that it's been said that gun reform is one of the few places where nearly 80% of the country is actually in agreement. How do we capitalize on that? And is there any hope of the parties working together? I'm curious about the capitalizing on that. Is that David or Lauren or Erica? You're sort of in the field. What do you feel about that? Is it a naive question?
I think we need to have some really uncomfortable, like some conversations that for frankly, a lot of white people are really uncomfortable, that I know I've had to talk with them about, you know, along with, you know, the book that that was written by Toni, like there's another book that I read too that was written by, I read it in like my gap year kind of, as I was on different planes and stuff, just traveling across the country. And it's a book not published by Penguin. So sorry if this is a bad plug, but it's written by an author. It's by an independent publisher, I think, called like City Lights. And it's written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who's like an Indigenous studies professor. And it talks about, and I know this, like even this part of the conversation might be an example of that uncomfortability of the fact that, in my opinion, I think if you look at the actual history of much of the Constitution, such as the Three-Fifths Compromise and things like that, even if we look at the Second Amendment, the root of the Second Amendment, like much of our Constitution, is in white supremacy. It's about the selective enforcement and use of sovereignty against Indigenous peoples and Black, quote unquote, non-citizens, as they were often seen when they were seen as when they were slaves in the United States. And even the question around Black citizenship is an entire conversation, historically speaking, that we can't even have on this Zoom call because it would take years to have, and all the incredibly messed up ways that has happened throughout our history. But if you look at the Second Amendment and what the book kind of goes into, is how the well-regulated militia in the Second Amendment was really Indigenous death squads. I even was reading some of the primary source documents and stuff about the illegal annexation of Cherokee lands, and even some Indigenous lands too in Western Georgia, near Alabama and stuff, and how basically the US government used armed white nationalist militias oftentimes as a way of clearing out these Western lands to not only expand the area where slaves were held, to stop a Haitian-style slave revolution from happening, which Jefferson and many of the founding fathers, who were white nationalists, were terrified of happening in the United States. And on top of that, once they did a lot of that work around Indigenous genocide and clearing out those lands for the settlement of poor white people that had come in from Europe. Sorry, the dog is going crazy, just destroying a toy. Sorry, this is not a funny topic though. I really should have asked, never mind, it's fine. But after that illegal annexation of those lands and taking those away, those patrols then evolved into slave patrols, which then later on evolved into our modern day policing systems. And we ask ourselves, why do these shootings keep happening, right? I don't think, like, if you look at the actual history, we wouldn't, and if we were actually taught the history of the United States that wasn't a white nationalist version of our history, which frankly it is, we wouldn't be asking the questions of why Black and brown people are murdered every day in extrajudicial killings by the police. And it's because that's what the system was made to do to begin with. And that's a really uncomfortable truth. Lauren and our families are military, they're veterans, and my father was in law enforcement. Many of my family members are in law enforcement. But I think we need to recognize that we need a system of public safety that is not rooted in genocide and the capture of freed slaves. And that doesn't mean abolishing public safety, but it means completely reimagining it and thinking, how can we build a system that actually protects every community and invests in public health and resources? Where the response to a shooting in a community that has them on a daily basis, like when I work with Erica in Jamaica, Queens, right, isn't more police or $1 million police watchtower over kids, literally conditioning them to go to prison, which is basically like the transformation of our slavery, of slavery in the United States under the 13th Amendment. And basically the system is creating it, institutionalizing slavery in a way that is legitimized to this day under the 13th Amendment in the form of mass incarceration. But instead, when we see gun violence, the response should be, how do we get kids more resources so they have teachers that actually can help them? How do we get kids resources and create not just equality in the United States, but equity, for the fact that the #1 predictor of where gun violence occurs in the United States is where communities were redlined in the 1930s and 40s by white nationalist and racist federal housing policies that created these vast inequities that drive gun violence to this day. These conversations are uncomfortable, but we need to have them because we've been waiting so long as a country to have them that millions of people have died as a result. And I don't care if it makes people uncomfortable, because the fact of the matter is people are dying every day as a result of not having these conversations.
Beyond that, really fast, I just want to say on the topic of uncomfortable conversations we need to have is not only the racism and white supremacy that these current and old gun laws were birthed out of, but also the racist history of gun violence prevention, right? The only time that real gun violence prevention acts have ever been, made in place and been, effective in a way is when it's taking guns away from Black, Brown, Indigenous.
Advocated for by the NRA.
Advocated for by the NRA, such as the Black Panthers. That's the only time when California ever passed, substantial gun laws. So it's also recognizing the racist history of gun violence prevention and trying to ensure that our prevention moving forward isn't also based in white supremacy.
It's interesting, coming in before this conversation started, I had sort of this binary view of the panel where we had one generation that's deliberately looking back at history on this issue, and then our two younger, I'm going to call you kids, who seemed fueled by sort of righteous anger and with social media tactics that my generation didn't understand. And you were so good at moving out and just taking people by the throat. And it's interesting to me that history now has become such a rooted part of your view of what the situation is that needs to be done. Which also speaks to the power of books, which I'll throw in because we're Random House. Senator Murphy, I wonder if you could say something.
That's also relative, right? Yep. That's relative to who gets access to have a voice, right? Because they're saying nothing different than a lot of young people that I know. They have more information. They have less information than a lot of young people that I know that had to travel through this road of real gun violence, right? And I don't want to say real, but but they don't have access to the platform, right? And so these type of conversations, and David is a king at this in making sure that the voices of the voiceless gets lifted, and so that's why he has me up in the middle of whatever and doing this thing. And we all know he does it for so many other folks, because unfortunately, the way the twisted world exists is that those who are most oppressed are muffled, right? You don't get to hear their voice. You don't get to hear their story. Their heart doesn't get to bring you to a new light that brings compassion to help those who are disenfranchised and just lack resources so that they could go to Harvard or any place else. Don't allow you to have access to those individuals. And if you do have access, it's from the platform of I'm the white person that's going to go save this Black person, as opposed to, no, let me, as Toni, I think, or someone in the beginning said, but as opposed to equal partners in this field, and we can move our total nation out of suffering, And so we definitely need to continue to shift that conversation and that narrative of just these wonderful, and kids are goats, so I'm not going to call them kids. I know that's a natural habit of us to do that. I do it too, and get corrected all the time. These phenomenal young people. I'm ready to turn my organization over to these young people right now today and just be a resource to stand on. But we know that a lot is wasted on the youth, and so they can't exist without us, and we can't exist without them. And so it is that equal balance that brings us all to the space of freedom.
Well, I should say I meant absolutely no disrespect. I have nothing but admiration. Toni, were you going to say something?
Yeah, going back to the structural inequities for a minute, defunding education seems like a regular thing that we're all used to in America, but anyone talks about defunding the police and tables are flipped, you know, in households and newsrooms and certainly, you know, police headquarters all over America. That's a backwards sort of way of creating a country, unless you want that country to sit a long time with white supremacy. And so we have to address the state of the public schools if we're ever going to address the state of our public health, because gun violence is part of our public health.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that I'm just, you know, echoing what everyone else has said. And it is nice to hear it from the young people. I hear it here from the young people, and if people in Arkansas, people who experienced violence in Florida, in the South in particular, are rising up like this, then I think there's hope in that. There's hope in that for sure.
You mentioned public health, and we have a few minutes left. Senator Murphy, one thing we haven't talked about, and we've been talking about violence against other people with guns, but you write about suicide in the book. And I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, 2/3 of the gun deaths every day in this country are suicides. And in many ways, they look very different than other types of gun crimes in this country. In some ways, they are similar. We have seen a massive increase in suicides in this country over the course of the last 5 years. But it is also interesting to note that we are not a global outlier on suicide rates. Like we are on homicide rates. There are countries that have higher suicide rates, even countries that have restrictions on firearms that we probably couldn't comprehend. And so I think that's important to understand. The suicide rate in the United States is largely driven by white rural males. As opposed to many of the other types of gun violence in this country that have different demographic profiles. And it similarly tracks poverty. But as Emil Durkheim, one of the sort of original sociologists attempting to understand suicide, said, suicide comes, you know, not necessarily from mental illness or from a tragic event in your life, but from a dislocation from your social context. And for white males in this country, who used to be sort of part of the blue collar aristocracy, they have had a fall from sort of their sort of perceived place in society. And that has been very hard to reconcile. And so I think it's important to sort of understand how different the suicide profile often looks from other types of gun crimes. At the same time, when it comes down to it, access to guns matters. A suicidal thought, you know, doesn't normally last more than 20 minutes. And so if you have access to a gun rather than a handful of drugs, well, then your chances of surviving those 20 minutes dramatically decrease. And so that's why, you know, when you look at states that have laws that make it just a little bit harder to get your hands on a gun, a waiting period, a permit, a background check, you have much lower suicide rates. And so it's a complicated sociological phenomenon, and it's really important to understand it. But again, similar to these other things we're talking about, just sort of relatively small changes in gun laws can actually get you a pretty significant rate on return. And you know, when you look at the data as to, okay, so why aren't African American populations, why aren't women, why don't you see the suicide rates in those populations? Well, it's for some pretty unfortunate and tragic reasons. Those populations sort of have been sort of dealing with systems of oppression, right? Have normalized trauma, lack of opportunity, falls from places. There's an ability to kind of roll with that in populations that have been, in which that kind of oppression has been normalized and regularized, and that's in part why it is a phenomenon today that happens to white males more than others.
there's also not as good of statistical gathering for deaths of Native American, African American people in this country who die by guns. So the data isn't as easily to be found. And so I think that's also part of why the statistics skew middle-aged and white, is because accidental gun death is a finding a lot of times in those communities when people just don't bother to look.
Yeah, I think on that point too, if we look at the per capita like statistics, like for every 100,000 people in the United States, if we separate it into those groups, I'm correct. I want somebody to fact check me on this, but I'm pretty sure I remember reading in some of the way too many gun violence books I read over my gap year, that Indigenous communities have a rate of police brutality per capita higher than any other ethnic group in the United States, and a way higher suicide rate than any group in the United States. It's just their overall size proportionally in the population is much smaller.
That's correct.
And I also want to touch on one thing too, like in respect to mental health, I'm really tired of seeing after every mass shooting, them talking about these white nationalist white men, like the shooter at my high school, who was a Trump supporter and literally recorded his manifesto in a Trump hat and talked about how much he literally had a history of talking of anti-Semitism basically. And we're like, oh, what happened to this person? All of a sudden, they're mentally ill. They're not. Mental illness. I'll give you an example of mental illness, depression, right? Like we can talk about that. It's not a mental illness, it's racism and xenophobia and intolerance and hatred. That is not a mental illness. If you want to talk about mental health, let's talk about the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides. And let's talk about the young people that go to sleep every night that I have worked with and continue to work with in March and in other gun violence prevention organizations that go to sleep every night to the sound of gunshots and see that as normalized, that are used to literally having to walk over chalk or blood that is on the sidewalk on their way to school because there was a shooting the night before and it's not been washed off because the police don't give it. Frankly, the police don't care about their community. And they're just so overwhelmed by these things happening because these structural inequities that it's just become normalized. We need to talk about the mental health of these kids that are in the communities, like we're in Jamaica, Queens, where Erica works. Working with her as an intern, acknowledging that I have no idea what goes on in Jamaica, Queens, but just wanting to be, to help in any way that I can. The number one predictor, and one of the few studies that had ever been done by the CDC on gun violence, was done in Wilmington, Delaware, and they found, I think it was 80% of people, one of the top predictors of who shoots someone else is if they've been shot before or somebody else they know has been shot before. And that's why programs like Erica's are so effective, because they focus on treating the trauma and treating the people that are affected by gun violence when they come into the hospital, because they know that they're not going to get justice in the first place, when their community is so under-resourced and the government purposely starves them to the point that young people, like some of the 13-year-olds and 12-year-olds literally that were picking up guns that Erica works with on a daily basis, feel the need to pick up a gun because they have no source of hope, and we got to talk about their mental health in the first place, so.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. We're out of time. There was one last question. How do we as American citizens stay informed on gun violence issues and inform other family, friends of this information? I would suggest that you start by going to LifeCount online or the website for March for Our Lives. But if you panelists know of another resource that people should be directed to, we've got a couple of seconds. I think that'll do it.
I would just encourage everyone, of course, I want you to go to March's website, but really please look up a local gun violence prevention organization in your area, or look up Erica's. It's in the chat, whoever has control over that. I hope you send Erica's. Again, please consider donating to Erica's. I would really appreciate it if you donated to March, but Erica is doing the work on a daily basis too. And it's not one organization that's going to solve this. It's going to be a coalition of organizations working to support each other to create a rising tide. So please, if you can, please consider supporting a local organization in your area that's focused on gun violence prevention. Or if you don't have, if you can't find one, please consider donating to Erica's group in Jamaica, Queens. They really, I've seen the work they do on a daily basis, and it is woefully underfunded in comparison to how much it should be. Also, you can donate to March, but please look into Erica's first.
That's an even better place to stop. So I want to thank all of you very much for a wonderful conversation.
Stop. Erica,
And I wish you all
think you're about
success.
to say something. Can you talk? I just don't want to stop before Erica says.
Oh, no, I was actually going to say goodbye.
something.
But and also that, you know, between March for Our Lives and Life Camp, we can connect you to any violence prevention organization around the nation. You know, just hit us up, and you know, we'll connect you to the orgs near you.
Great. Thank you very much.